The first snow of winter arrived early in the Wyoming territory. Thin white flakes drifted across the dusty streets of Willow Creek, settling on wagon tracks and wooden storefronts that had seen better days. Near the church steps, a young woman stood alone. Her coat was worn, her boots had been repaired more times than anyone could count. And clutched tightly against her chest was a small wooden music box, the only thing she owned that carried any real value. As townsfolk hurried past, she lowered her eyes and whispered words no one was meant to hear. "I own nothing," she believed it. After years of loss, disappointment, and loneliness, she truly believed she had nothing left to offer the world. What she didn't know was that someone had heard her. And that single moment would change two lives forever. The young woman's name was Grace. She rented a tiny room above the town bakery. The room was barely large enough for a bed and a washstand. When the wind blew hard, cold air slipped through the cracks in the walls. Still, Grace never complained. Every morning before sunrise, she helped clean the bakery in exchange for reduced rent. Every evening, she mended clothes for neighbors to earn a few extra coins. Most people in Willow Creek knew her story. At least, they thought they did. Years earlier, a fever had taken both her parents. The small farm they owned had been sold to pay debts. Since then, Grace had drifted from town to town, surviving however she could. No family. No land, no inheritance, nothing except the little music box she kept hidden beneath her pillow each night. The music box had belonged to her mother. Its paint was faded, one corner was chipped. But whenever Grace opened it, a soft melody filled the room and brought back memories of gentler days. It reminded her that she had once been loved. Several miles outside town stood the Hale Ranch. Its owner, Luke Hale, was known throughout the county. Tall and broad-shouldered, Luke worked harder than any ranch hand under him. He wasn't wealthy by Eastern standards. But in Willow Creek, he was respected. People trusted him. Children waved when he rode through town. Shopkeepers greeted him by name, yet despite all that respect, Luke lived a quiet life. Most evenings, he preferred the company of horses to people. There was an emptiness he rarely spoke about. His father had built the ranch. His father had also taught him something he never forgot. A person's worth isn't measured by what they own. Luke remembered those words often, especially after hearing Grace's whisper outside the church. A few days later, Luke saw her again. An elderly widow named Mrs. Bell struggled to carry two heavy water buckets through the snow-covered street. Before anyone else could react, Grace hurried forward. She took both buckets and carried them all the way to the widow's cabin. The older woman offered payment. Grace refused. Luke watched from horseback. The act lasted less than 2 minutes. Yet something about it stayed with him. The following week brought another storm. A young boy slipped on an icy boardwalk and dropped a sack of potatoes. The bag burst open. Potatoes rolled everywhere. Several townspeople laughed. Grace didn't. She knelt in the snow and helped gather every last potato. The boy thanked her repeatedly. Grace simply smiled and sent him home. Again, Luke happened to see it. Again, he said nothing. Life in Willow Creek wasn't easy for Grace. Many people liked her, others judged her. Among them was Clara Finch, the daughter of the town's wealthiest merchant. Clara was beautiful, confident, and accustomed to admiration. For years, many believed she would eventually marry Luke Hale. Clara certainly believed it. The problem was that Luke had never shown interest. That fact irritated her more with each passing month, and lately she had noticed something troubling. Luke's eyes seemed to follow Grace, only briefly, only occasionally, but Clara noticed, and she didn't like it. One Sunday after church, gossip spread across town. Grace was standing near the churchyard when two women whispered loudly enough for her to hear. "Poor thing, she has no family, no future either. Some people simply aren't meant for more." Grace pretended not to hear, but their words cut deep because part of her feared they were true. Across the street, Luke overheard every word. His jaw tightened, yet Grace walked away without defending herself, without anger, without bitterness, only sadness. That hurt him more than the gossip itself. A week later, another act of kindness caught his attention. Old Mr. Turner owned the town's smallest stable. One evening, his horse became tangled in broken fencing. Most people had already gone home. Grace happened to pass by. Without hesitation, she climbed into the muddy pen. The horse kicked and struggled, yet she spoke softly until the frightened animal calmed down. Then she helped free it. By the time Mr. Turner arrived, the horse was safe. Grace left before anyone could praise her. Luke had witnessed everything. For the third time, he found himself wondering why someone with so little always seemed willing to give so much. Winter deepened, snow piled against buildings, business slowed, money became scarce. Grace worked longer hours. Still, she continued helping others whenever she could. One evening, she delivered fresh bread to a sick family. Another day, she spent hours reading Bible passages to an elderly man losing his eyesight. She never asked for recognition. Never expected gratitude, she simply did what needed to be done, and somehow Luke always seemed nearby, watching, learning, remembering. One cold afternoon, Grace sat alone beside the frozen creek outside town. She opened her music box. The familiar melody drifted through the air. For a moment, tears filled her eyes. She thought no one was there, but Luke had ridden down the trail and stopped when he heard the music. He remained hidden among the trees, not spying, not intruding, simply listening. He watched Grace close her eyes as the melody played, and for the first time he realized how lonely she truly was. Not lonely because she lacked people, lonely because she believed she didn't matter. The realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. That same evening, something unexpected happened. A writer arrived in Willow Creek carrying urgent news. The town gathered inside the general store as word spread. A nearby ranch had suffered devastating losses during the storm. Several families were in desperate need of supplies, food, blankets, medicine. The townspeople quickly began discussing donations. Most offered small contributions. A few offered nothing at all. Then Grace quietly stepped forward. She looked down at the wooden music box in her hands, the only precious thing she owned, the one possession she treasured above everything else, and slowly, she placed it on the donation table. The room fell silent. Even Luke stared in disbelief, because everyone in Willow Creek knew how much that music box meant to her, and yet she was willing to give it away. But before anyone could react, the merchant examining donations suddenly frowned. Then he said something that made Grace's face turn completely pale. Something that threatened to expose a painful secret she had hidden for years, and the entire room turned toward her. The silence inside the general store felt heavier than the winter air outside. Grace stood frozen beside the donation table. The merchant, Mr. Briggs, held the music box in both hands. His eyes narrowed as he examined the worn carving on its underside. Then he looked up. "Where did you get this?" Grace's face lost all color. Several townspeople exchanged curious glances. "It belonged to my mother," she answered softly. Mr. Briggs continued staring at the box. "I've seen this mark before." The room grew quieter. Luke stepped closer without realizing it. Years of frontier life had taught him when someone was carrying old pain. Grace suddenly looked as if she were carrying the weight of an entire lifetime. Mr. Briggs turned the music box over. "This was made by Samuel Reed," a few older townspeople gasped. Samuel Reed had once been one of the finest craftsmen in the territory. His handmade music boxes were rare. Collectors paid good money for them. Mr. Briggs swallowed. "This little box could bring enough money to feed several families through winter." Murmurs spread through the room. People stared at Grace differently now, not because she was wealthy, but because she had just placed the most valuable thing she owned on the donation table without hesitation. Grace lowered her eyes. She hadn't known its monetary value. To her, its worth had always been emotional. It was the last piece of her mother, nothing more, nothing less. Luke watched her carefully. Most people would have immediately taken the box back. Grace did not. Instead, she quietly pushed it farther onto the table. "If it can help them," she whispered, "then they need it more than I do." No one spoke, not even Clara. For the first time in years, the entire town saw Grace through different eyes, but not everyone welcomed that change. The following week, Willow Creek buzzed with conversation. Everywhere people went, they discussed Grace's sacrifice. At the bakery, at church, along the boardwalk, even ranch hands spoke about it. Luke heard the story repeated half a dozen times. Yet each retelling left out something important. People praised the donation, but few understood what Grace had truly surrendered. She had given away her final connection to her family. That mattered far more than its value. One snowy morning, Luke arrived at town earlier than usual. Outside the schoolhouse, he noticed a small crowd. A young girl named Emma sat crying on the steps. Her coat sleeve had torn badly. The other children had begun teasing her. Before anyone else reacted, Grace knelt beside the girl. She removed her own sewing kit from her bag. Then she sat in the cold and carefully repaired the sleeve. The entire time she spoke softly to the child. When Emma finally smiled again, Grace sent her inside. Luke remained across the street, watching another kindness, another moment nobody had asked for, another reminder of who Grace truly was. Days later, a fierce windstorm swept through Willow Creek. One of the church windows shattered. The pastor worried because repairs would cost money the congregation didn't have. The next morning, he discovered someone had spent hours cleaning broken glass and boarding up the opening. No note, no request for recognition, nothing. By noon, everyone learned it had been Grace. Luke wasn't surprised. Meanwhile, Clara Finch grew increasingly frustrated. The town's attention had shifted. People spoke warmly about Grace. Children waved when she passed. Neighbors stopped to chat. Even women who once pitied her now admired her. Clara hated it. More importantly, she noticed something else. Luke had begun visiting town more often. And somehow his path always crossed Grace's, sometimes at the bakery, sometimes near the church, sometimes on the road leading toward the creek. They rarely exchanged more than a few words. Yet Clara saw enough. A dangerous possibility was taking shape, and she intended to stop it. One afternoon, Clara found Grace outside the mercantile. The street was nearly empty. Snow drifted lazily from gray skies. Clara approached with a polite smile that never reached her eyes. "You should be careful." Grace looked confused. "Careful about what?" Clara folded her arms. "People talk." Grace said nothing. "They think Luke feels sorry for you." The words landed harder than Clara knew, or perhaps exactly as hard as she intended. Grace forced a small smile. "I'm sure Luke doesn't spend much time thinking about me." Clara stepped closer. "You and I both know women like me marry men like Luke." Grace lowered her gaze. "And women like me don't." Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence said enough. That evening, Grace sat alone in her room above the bakery. The absence of the music box felt strange. The room seemed quieter than ever. For years, whenever loneliness became too heavy, she would open the lid and listen to the melody. Now there was only silence. Clara's words echoed in her mind. "Women like me, women like me, women like me." Grace stared out the frost-covered window. Perhaps Clara was right. Luke deserved someone with land, a future, a family name. Not a woman who owned nothing. Several days later, another opportunity for kindness appeared. A traveling family arrived in town after their wagon axle broke. They had little food. Their youngest child was sick. Most townspeople helped where they could. Grace quietly offered nearly all of her weekly earnings. No one asked her to, no one expected it, yet she gave anyway. When Luke later learned what she had done, something shifted inside him. He had spent months observing, months noticing, months quietly gathering evidence of the person Grace truly was. And every observation led to the same conclusion. She gave more than anyone he had ever known. Winter tightened its grip on the territory, then disaster struck the Hale ranch. A violent storm damaged several barns. 2 horses were injured. A ranch hand broke his arm. For days, Luke barely slept. Repairs consumed every waking hour. One bitter morning, exhausted and frustrated, he rode into town seeking supplies. As he approached the church, he noticed several women organizing meals for injured ranch workers. At the center of the effort stood Grace. She was directing volunteers, packing food, gathering blankets, checking medicine, helping families she barely knew, helping Luke's ranch without being asked. Without expecting thanks, the sight stopped him cold, because in that moment he finally understood something. Grace wasn't kind when it was convenient. She was kind when it cost her something. That difference mattered a lot. A week later, Luke visited the neighboring ranch that had received donations. There he made a surprising discovery: the music box had not been sold. Instead, the family who received it had learned its story. Unable to part with something so meaningful, they had preserved it carefully. They planned to return it someday when circumstances improved. Luke held the box briefly in his hands. The familiar carving caught the sunlight. He imagined Grace giving it away, imagined the loneliness behind that choice. Imagined what it must feel like to surrender the last piece of someone you loved. That evening, he rode home carrying thoughts he could no longer ignore. Meanwhile, Grace's doubts continued growing. The more people praised her, the less worthy she felt, because praise couldn't change reality. She still owned almost nothing, still had no family, still had no future she could clearly see. And every time she noticed Luke nearby, her heart became more confused. Hope was dangerous, especially for someone accustomed to disappointment, so she made a decision, a painful one. One she told no one, not even her closest friends. She would leave Willow Creek when spring arrived, find work elsewhere. Start over somewhere. Luke Hale wasn't a daily reminder of a dream she could never have. For the first time in months, she began quietly preparing, saving coins, packing belongings, making plans. And she believed no one knew, but one evening, as the sun disappeared behind snow-covered hills, Luke accidentally overheard a conversation that changed everything. A conversation revealing that Grace intended to leave town forever, and for the first time in his life, fear gripped his heart. The news reached Luke by accident. He had stopped at the bakery just before closing time to pick up bread for his ranch hands. Inside, Grace was speaking quietly with the owner. "I'll be leaving after the spring thaw," she said. The words struck Luke harder than any storm. Leaving, not visiting, not traveling, leaving, forever. Luke remained outside long after the conversation ended. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he walked back toward his horse. For months he had convinced himself there was time to understand his feelings, time to learn more about Grace. Time to decide what he wanted. Now that time suddenly felt very short, and for the first time in years, Luke Hale didn't know what to do. The following weeks passed painfully. Grace continued her daily routines. She helped neighbors, worked at the bakery, volunteered at church, cared for children, checked on the elderly. She smiled when people greeted her. Yet beneath that smile lived a quiet sadness. Every familiar place in Willow Creek had become difficult to leave. The church, the creek, the dusty streets, even the tiny room above the bakery. She had never truly belonged anywhere. And now she was preparing to leave the one town that had started to feel like home, because staying hurt too much. Every time she saw Luke, hope whispered dangerous things. Hope told her maybe she mattered. Hope told her maybe she was enough, but experience had taught her not to trust hope. Luke, meanwhile, found himself noticing Grace everywhere. He noticed the way children ran toward her, the way old men smiled when she approached, the way widows invited her inside for tea. The way she always listened when others spoke, the way she made people feel seen, the way she quietly disappeared whenever praise came her way. Each observation deepened something inside him. Something that could no longer be ignored. Then spring finally arrived. Snow melted from rooftops. Mud replaced ice along the roads. Birds returned to the valley. And on a cool morning beneath a pale blue sky, Grace packed her few belongings into a small wagon. The sight was heartbreaking: one blanket, a few dresses, a sewing kit, several books. And little else, years of life reduced to a handful of possessions. The townspeople who cared about her gathered to say goodbye. Mrs. Bell cried openly. The schoolchildren hugged her. The pastor thanked her for everything she had done. Even people who had once judged her seemed saddened by her departure. Grace smiled through tears, yet her heart felt heavier with every farewell. Soon only one goodbye remained, the one she secretly feared most. Luke never came. As the wagon rolled toward the edge of town, she told herself that was for the best. Then she heard hoofbeats. Fast. Urgent, growing louder. She turned. A rider was racing down the road. Dust rose behind him. The horse slowed only when it reached her wagon. Luke Hale swung down from the saddle, breathing hard. Eyes fixed entirely on her. For a moment neither spoke. The world seemed strangely still. "You're leaving?" Grace nodded. "Yes." Luke glanced at the packed wagon. Without saying goodbye, a sad smile appeared. I didn't think it would matter. The answer hurt him more than she realized. It matters. She looked away. Luke, but he wasn't finished. Not this time, not after months of silence, not after nearly losing the chance entirely. He stepped closer. Grace, I need you to listen. The seriousness in his voice made her stop breathing for a second. Luke looked toward the distant town, then back at her. I saw you carry water for Mrs. Bell. Grace blinked. What? I saw you help that boy gather potatoes. She stared silently. I saw you rescue Mr. Turner's horse. His voice remained steady. I saw you repair Emma's coat. A tear formed in Grace's eye. Luke continued. I saw you read to Mr. Dawson when his eyesight failed. Another tear followed. I saw you organize meals after the storm. His voice softened. I saw you give away your earnings. The tears spilled freely now. Luke took another step forward. And I saw you place the most important thing you owned on that donation table because other people needed help. Grace covered her mouth. Months. He had been watching for months, not judging. Not pitying, seeing, truly seeing. Luke's eyes never left hers. Do you know what I learned from all of that? Grace slowly shook her head. His voice became rough with emotion. I learned that you're the strongest person I've ever known. She immediately looked down. No, yes, I own nothing. The familiar words escaped before she could stop them. The same words she had whispered months earlier outside the church. The same words she had built her life around. Luke gently reached for her hand. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she let him take it. His grip was warm and steady. Grace. Her name sounded different coming from him. I need you to hear something. She looked up. Luke swallowed. Then spoke from the deepest part of his heart. You think your worth comes from land. She remained silent. You think it comes from money. A tear slid down her cheek. You think it comes from family names and possessions. His grip tightened slightly. But every person in this town is better because you're in it. Grace began crying openly. Luke continued. You've spent years giving pieces of yourself away. His own eyes glistened now, and somehow you've never realized what you've become. The road was completely silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then Grace asked the question she had carried in her heart for months, the question she never imagined saying aloud. Why me? Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Why me? Luke smiled sadly because he knew exactly what she meant. Why not Clara? Why not someone wealthier? Why not someone with more to offer? Why her? Luke took a long breath, then answered. Because when people are hurting, you notice. A tear rolled down Grace's face. Because when someone needs help, you show up. Luke's voice trembled slightly. Because you gave away the last piece of your mother to help strangers. More tears followed. Because every time life gave you a reason to become bitter, you chose kindness instead. Grace could no longer speak. Luke stepped closer. Because I've met women with bigger houses, he smiled softly. I've met women with more money. Another step. I've met women who owned far more than you ever have. Now only inches separated them, but none of them are you. Grace's heart felt as though it might burst. Years of loneliness. Years of believing she wasn't enough, years of feeling invisible, all colliding into a single moment. Luke looked directly into her eyes. The eyes he had quietly searched for every time he rode into town, the eyes he never wanted to lose. Then he finally said the words that had been waiting inside him for months. I don't care what you own. Grace broke down completely. Luke gently lifted her trembling hand. And with tears shining in his eyes, he said, You're all I've ever wanted. For several seconds, neither moved. The entire world seemed to disappear. Only truth remained. Grace had spent years believing she possessed nothing. Yet standing there on that frontier road, she suddenly realized something extraordinary. The things Luke loved most about her could never be bought, could never be inherited, could never be lost. Her kindness, her courage, her heart, those were her true treasures. And they had been there all along. Several weeks later, Willow Creek celebrated the wedding. The entire town attended. Children scattered flower petals outside the church. Neighbors filled every pew. Mrs. Bell cried even harder than before. The pastor struggled not to smile throughout the ceremony. Even Clara Finch sat quietly in the back. Time and humility had softened some of her bitterness. When the vows were spoken, there wasn't a dry eye in the church, not because the wedding was grand, but because everyone knew what it represented. Two lonely hearts had finally found home. After the ceremony, Luke surprised Grace with a gift, a small wooden box. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside lay her mother's music box, perfectly restored. The chipped corner had been repaired, the faded paint carefully renewed. The melody remained exactly the same. Grace stared in disbelief. Tears immediately filled her eyes. Luke smiled. The neighboring ranch family had returned it, and Luke had spent weeks arranging its restoration. "It belongs with you." Grace pressed the music box to her chest. For a moment she couldn't speak. Then she whispered the only words she could find, "Thank you." Years later, people still told the story. Children who grew up in Willow Creek heard it countless times. Not because it was a love story, though it certainly was. Not because it ended with marriage, though it did. People remembered it because it revealed something important. The world often measures worth by possessions, by wealth, by status, by what can be counted, but the things that matter most are rarely visible: kindness, faithfulness, compassion, sacrifice, love. Those treasures cannot be bought, yet they are worth more than anything else on earth, and Grace had carried them all along without realizing it. If this story touched your heart, remember this lesson: never measure your value by what you own. The right people will see the treasures hidden inside you. And sometimes, the person who believes they have nothing to offer becomes the greatest blessing in someone else's life. What was your favorite moment in Grace and Luke's journey? Let me know in the comments.